Okay guys, so today we are doing ground effect. So really important, kind of the basis of all of the helicopter stuff. If you can get your head around the ground effect stuff, doesn't matter what helicopter you're going to fly, you're going to encounter the benefits of this at some point or rely on them. Generally speaking, if you're ever going to have to pick up any kind of supplies or any other extra load on your aircraft, or if you are operating somewhere where you've got a higher density altitude where you've got less power at hand and poorer performance, and again ground effect is going to help you out. So if you can understand the fundamentals behind it and also the areas where it's most likely going to catch you out, then it will forever help you be a better pilot. Main references for it are the 3, 4, 5, 6 as always, but the same principles apply in pretty much every single publication you'll ever read. So to start it out then, if you've got the time and you're allowed to, then prepare the board. And generally speaking, I go for about 1 to 2 diagrams and the vector diagram in the middle. Alrighty, so to start off with, the aircraft we're going to use here is a helicopter in the hover. So what's happening in the hover? Well, we're creating lift by the rotors turning, which, as we know from the vector diagram, we know that we're actually going to increase airflow down through the disc, which we're going to call induced flow. If it's just sitting in a high hover miles away from the ground, then that airflow is going to come down from the top of the disc and it's going to come out of the disc at the bottom. And generally speaking, it's just going to go straight down. It's going to disperse out to the side to a certain extent, and any other environmental conditions might affect it, but more or less we're going to have the same size column of air coming down through the top as we're going to have coming out of the top, out of the bottom, in the same sort of shape. What does that look like? Well, if we've got a large amount of lift on the rotors, on the blades, in order to hold that helicopter a long way away from the ground, then therefore we're going to have probably quite a high pitch, and we're also going to have a nice big amount of induced flow. So we'll make it big. If it's big, then generally speaking our angle of attack is quite small. Giving us a large amount of lift, but at a cost. Because we're having to use quite a large pitch angle to get the angle of attack required to get the lift, and it's giving us all this drag. So I'm not going to label it all, but we can see that our total rotor thrust is pretty high because we need it to be quite high in order to counteract our equal and opposite weight. And our rotor drag is also quite high, and therefore if it's quite high, we're going to need quite a large amount of torque just to control that. So that's the OGE, outside of ground effect. That's the effect we have. Now what we're going to look at is the IGE and the effect that putting the ground underneath the aircraft has. So first of all, we can see the aircraft is going to be drawing in air from that column of air above it. It's going to come through the bottom of the aircraft like this. But look what happens here. It's now going to impact the ground. It can't go through it. It's probably not going to go that way because it's not the path of least resistance. So it's going to go outwards. This is the important bit to understand then, to try and explain this part. So what I'm going to show you is 3 different ways to explain it, which might help you provide the correct explanation, teaching method, but also it might help you to understand it in your own way. So the first way I'm going to explain is the sort of party line method, okay? And that's Bernoulli's principle. Okay, so if we imagine this is our rotor disc and we're drawing all our air through, okay, but it's then going to hit the ground, it's going to disperse. So when we look at how the airflow is shaped, it's coming through the top, through the disc, it's coming out to the bottom, but because it's hitting the ground and dispersing, it's diverging away from itself. So this comes into the Bernoulli's principle of when you get an increase in velocity, you get a decrease in pressure, and vice versa. If you get a decrease in velocity, you're going to get an increase in pressure. That can then be related directly to ducts. So here we've got a divergent duct, and as you can see, as the air comes through at the very, very top, we've got a small surface area. So we're ramming a set volume of air through that small surface area. So it has to speed up, technically speaking, but whatever speed that is, when we get the same volume of air and we spread it out over a large surface area, it doesn't have to go so fast to get through that hole as it did to go through there. You're essentially trying to get a hell of a lot of air through a small hole there, and not very much, and the same amount of air through a very large hole here. So therefore what happens is the velocity at the divergent duct comes down, and the pressure therefore goes up. So that's the way, generally speaking, you will explain this. The divergent duct is actually the air parting away from itself at the bottom and going its separate way, which is causing an increase in pressure. If you've got that increase in pressure down here, and therefore if you've got an increase in velocity and a decrease in pressure up here, you'll have a lower pressure in the vicinity of the disc. High pressure always wants to go to low pressure. So technically speaking, you've got an element of pressure or force moving this way up against our induced flow. If we've got anything that's slowing or countering the induced flow that's coming through, it's going to reduce the speed of that induced flow. So therefore we're going to get a reduction in induced flow. So that's the first and the primary way of explaining it. A second way of explaining it that might be useful for some, okay, is a friction method. The same thing applies, however, it's looking at the differences of environmental conditions or obstructions on the air. So when the air comes in the top and gets drawn in through the top of the disc, much like up at the top of the atmosphere, the top of the Earth, as the air gets drawn into a high pressure system, it gets drawn in, it drops down, and at the bottom, when it impacts the Earth, it spreads out. Realistically, that's going to look like that, isn't it? Same for the other one. Now, the way the friction method works is there's no obstructions to the air as it comes through here, so it flows into the top quite quickly without anything obstructing its movement. But as soon as it comes down and impacts the ground is now going to slow this air movement, and that's the air all around it. So the more time it has in contact with the ground, the more impact the ground has on its velocity. If we start to slow this ground and add obstructions, then the flow rate of the air at the bottom here is going to reduce. If we've got a lower flow rate down here than we've got coming in, then we're going to cause a back pressure. In other words, the air isn't moving out of the way down here fast enough for the rate that the air is moving in at the top. So exactly the same thing applies. We end up with a slow back pressure moving up and again reducing that induced flow. Third attempt, if you still haven't got it there, this is another way of tackling it with an analogy, and that's the traffic analogy. Okay, so if we imagine instead of the airflow, we've got cars moving down a motorway. The cars are moving pretty freely down the motorway. Okay, and you don't really need to look at it so much as a divergent duct, but at some point in the future, and this is where the friction or the pressure comes in, at some point in the future a traffic jam starts to form at the front, and for whatever reason the car at the front comes to a standstill. If that car comes at the standstill, then the car immediately behind will start to slow down. That will cause that concertina effect. So slowly, the further away you get from that the car that's stopped at the front, the further away you get from it, the faster the cars are going to be moving, and vice versa. The closer you get to the car at the front, the slower you're going to be moving. This concertina effect eventually will impact in the disc and make the cars coming through the very top entrance have to slow down. So again, that gives you the same effect of reducing that induced flow. This is quite a good way of looking at it a little bit later on, because trying to understand why moving the aircraft up and down away from the ground and the effect that has is quite a good way of explaining it. So as you can see here, like I said, the closer you get to that static vehicle at the front, the slower you get. So the same applies if I move the aircraft further away from the ground. There's a longer space, a longer time for that air to slow down before I get to the ground. So therefore the air or the vehicle, however we're looking at it now, closest to the disc, if we're a long way away from the ground, won't be impacted quite so much by that slow moving air or that slow moving traffic at the front. However, if I bring that disc really close to the ground, then clearly, as you can see, we're going to be impacted very, very quickly by this static air that's just impacted the ground. So there's the three different methods of explaining it. So how does that look on the vector diagram? Now this is what will essentially give you your beneficial effects. So if we've got a reduced induced flow, for the benefit here, we'll just halve our induced flow altogether. We're going to get a steeper angle for our relative airflow, and that therefore is going to give us a higher angle of attack. So the way we can start to build this is we add IF goes up, angle of attack goes up, lift goes up. Now we are going to get an increase in drag, but it's not going to be enough to have an effect. And the reason why is because we've brought the relative airflow to a steeper angle. That's essentially because the lift acts perpendicular to the relative airflow. That's brought that lift vector to a slightly more vertical point, which has pulled our drag forward. So from the diagram, we actually get a lower rotor drag. Fill the arrow in. So our lift has gone up, but our rotor drag has gone down. Now, if our rotor drag has gone down, but we've got the same torque, then essentially what's going to happen is the blades are going to speed up. So depending on what helicopter you are flying, you're going to have a governor or a electronic control unit or engine control unit, which is going to essentially change the fuel metering to reduce your NR. And so that all that effect is going to have, it's going to reduce your torque. So that's our first benefit of being in ground effect. We've reduced our induced flow, we've increased our angle of attack, and because we've increased our angle of attack, we've reduced our rotor drag, and therefore we've reduced the amount of torque. So if you've got a governor or an ECU, that's instantly done that first torque adjustment for you. Most of you won't notice that happen or you won't have to put any control inputs in to action that reduction in torque. It will just reduce the amount of fuel going into the engine to give you a less torque. So that's the first one. The next one we're going to get, though, as you can see, is the vertical component. So because our lift went up and we lent the whole lift vector forwards, that's also increased our total rotor thrust. So if our total rotor thrust goes up but our weight hasn't changed at all, then we're going to start accelerating upwards. And that's the one bit that you will notice, and that's the one bit that you will have to affect yourself. And generally speaking, you notice that by having to lower the collective once you get into ground effect in order to stop the aircraft from climbing up. So when we lower the collective, obviously what we're doing is reducing that torque. So what we get is torque times 2 reduction. And that's an important thing to bring out when you're describing ground effect. And that essentially explains how ground effect happens, how it can affect you, and also how it can benefit you. But the important thing to now look at and bring in at the very, very end is where you might encounter this. So the first one we've already talked about. It's when you're hovering high outside of ground effect. That's when you're going to notice the disadvantage and you're going to lose the benefits of ground effect. But there are other areas where you're also going to lose the benefit. So it's only 3. You can prepare this beforehand. So rough ground, wind and slope. So we'll look at the first one then, because it tends to be the most complicated one that people find difficult to understand. Rough ground or terrain, you can see it written in different ways. So why does this affect it? So the air comes through the top of the disc as before, but as it comes into contact with the ground, where it would usually disperse and go to the side, generally speaking it does. But if you've got rough ground, it obviously depends on the sort of ground you've got. It needs to be quite rough ground, but generally speaking, what these little cavities and the nature of the ground will create is various venturis and little extra ducts as well. So you won't get a nice smooth divergent duct. If you've got nice smooth movement of air away being slowed in a linear manner, then generally speaking you're going to get that Bernoulli effect. You're going to get that reduction in velocity and then that backup of high pressure. If you've got disruption to that duct, then what you'll find is actually the air will change direction. It will speed up in some places as well, and you'll get a difference in pressure distribution around that sort of ground plate underneath the aircraft. And essentially that will just disrupt the pressure build up all the way up to the aircraft, and you won't get that same reduction in induced flow. The next one is wind. This is pretty self-explanatory in that we need a divergent duct, which is nicely forming underneath. However, if we then get a load of wind, then actually, rather than the induced flow through the aircraft coming out into a divergent duct, it's not dissimilar to this in that the air is just basically just being blown all in one direction. So the surface area of the duct here is pretty much the same as the surface area of the duct here. There's no real change. Therefore, if we haven't got a divergent duct and we haven't got any friction of the air on the ground here as well, then this air can pretty much keep flowing at the same speed. And in some cases, maybe even faster. So you're definitely going to lose your ground effect there. And then the last one is the slope. Which pretty much acts exactly the same as the wind effect. So the air is going to come through the disc. And again, without forming a divergent duct, we lose that reduction in velocity of the air and therefore the increase in pressure. The same thing here, we're having the air directed away from its normal path and back towards to recreate the same duct area both above, below and below the aircraft, and therefore we're not getting that reduction in speed and increase in pressure. That's always important to understand, because if you're about to make an approach or depart from somewhere which have any of those effects and you're heavy, high, then you just need to think about whether you've got the power to do it. And that should answer the question. As always, please feel free to put any comments underneath where you disagree, would like any clarity, have questions, or any criticism. Always open to it. Thank you very much.